Hello, class. This is the AP Euro Unit 4 Extra Credit Test Review. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go through this test review and discuss what I think goes into these answers. And we're going to start with Chapter 16. This is Chapters 16 and 18. Those two chapters comprise Unit 4. And we're beginning with describing heliocentrism and geocentrism. And keep in mind, that geocentrism is the view that the Earth is the center of the universe. Geo means Earth, centrism means center, and all of the heavenly bodies revolve around it. Heliocentrism is the view that the sun is the center of the universe and all the heavenly bodies, including the earth, revolve around the sun. And so let's just go through this table and look at these various scientists, their scientific fields, and their achievements. And let's begin with Aristotle. Aristotle was many things in the scientific field, most notably for us, it was in physics, and he was an ancient Greek physicist. And with regard to achievements, he said that matter on Earth was composed of 4 elemental substances: earth, fire, water, and wind. And he had a geocentric view of the universe. And he had the view of the heavenly bodies being embedded in a system of concentric crystal spheres. And that would explain why the stars seem to move congruently. Copernicus, he was the astronomer who put heliocentrism on the map. And so his scientific field was also astronomy. And with regard to achievements, in 1543, he wrote on the revolution of the heavenly spheres. But he also knew that his calculations did not completely support heliocentrism. And then we move on to Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe was a Danish astronomer. He spent years at an observatory just collecting data. He used this data to create the Rudolphine tables. This data, however, could not be reconciled to heliocentrism as it was understood at the time. And that leads us to Johannes Kepler. Johannes Kepler was also an astronomer, and he reconciled the Rudolphine tables of Tycho Brahe to this heliocentric theory with his 3 laws of planetary motion. If you looked at Brahe's Rudolphine tables with these 3 laws of planetary motion in mind, suddenly heliocentrism looked a lot more plausible, a lot more definite. And that takes us to Galileo. Galileo was an astronomer and an instrument maker and a science nut. And he chipped away at geocentrism from multiple angles. For example, even though Kepler had come up with the 3 laws of planetary motion, he couldn't explain why planets moved in the first place. Aristotle had said that objects don't move unless an outside force acts upon them. Take that force away, objects stop moving. And that was a big problem for Kepler. But Galileo demonstrated the law of inertia, which said that being in motion was actually an object's natural state. Being stationary was actually not natural. Now you had the actual mechanics to explain planetary motion. And that takes us to Sir Isaac Newton, physicist, mathematician. The word you want to think of with Sir Isaac Newton is synthesis. He synthesized the work of all those previous astronomers into one unified piece that he called Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, also known simply as Principia. And in that work, he demonstrated the laws of universal gravitation, which said that gravity worked the same way everywhere in the universe, whether on Earth or out in space, and that you could easily calculate gravitational force based on mass and distance. Sir Francis Bacon was an English scientist, and he improved methods for scientific experimentation and scientific inquiry, most notably with this thing called empiricism, also known as inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning means that you consider only what you can observe and measure. You don't speculate, you don't assume, you don't let your biases and your prejudices get in the way. That conflicts with René Descartes, mathematician. As far as advances, achievements, René Descartes also made advances in experimentation. He gave us the discipline of mechanics. He said that particles that comprise matter were in constant motion, and his approach to knowledge was through what he called deductive reasoning. Easy to remember, Descartes, D-E, deductive reasoning, D-E. In deductive reasoning, you doubt your senses. And I quoted Obi-Wan Kenobi, who told Luke Skywalker, your senses can deceive you, don't trust them. That's what he believed. The key word to think of when you think of deductive reasoning is doubt. Doubt everything that you can possibly doubt about an idea until you arrive at a point where all that's left is something that absolutely cannot be doubted. When you have that, you've got what he called a first principle, and you could use that idea that could not be doubted any further as a basis for further scientific inquiry. That takes us to Galen. Galen was not from the modern age. Galen was actually an ancient Greek doctor. You can kind of think of him as the Aristotle of physiology. And Galen believed that diseases came from an imbalance in one or more of the four humors. Those four humors were the four liquids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And so he believed that any kind of disease was caused by an imbalance in these humors. And therefore, if you were sick, it might be because you had too much blood in your body, creating an imbalance, and some of that blood had to be let out. Hence, bloodletting, which was popular for centuries. And that leads us to Vesalius, Flemish doctor. He published a book called On the Structure of the Human Body. He did countless dissections of corpses, and he was great at drawing, and he published about 200 drawings of human anatomy in this book. He also disproved the four humors. William Harvey was an English doctor who did likewise experiments on corpses, and he discovered the circulatory system and found out what the heart did. In this discovery, what he did was he redefined the human body as a machine with integrated systems that covered the entire body. For example, the circulatory system, blood circulates all over the body. And so he defined the body as a machine, much the same way that Descartes defined the entire universe as a machine. So where were the centers of scientific and Enlightenment thought? The big centers, and of course you had other places in this too, but the big centers were France, England, and Italy. In other words, Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, Russia, and places like that, not so much was going on. Much more traditional. So Galileo and the church, what happened there? Well, Galileo actually had a good relationship with the Catholic Church for many years. He had friends in the church, and the church supported much of his work. But he forced the church to respond to his belief in heliocentrism. He wrote a book in which he basically called high church officials stupid for believing in geocentrism. He was dragged in front of the Holy Office, also called the Roman Inquisition. We talked about that when we talked about the Counter-Reformation. And he was forced to recant his belief in heliocentrism, which the court called the Copernican heresy. And he was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Of course, he was already old by that time. So what's the difference between Sir Francis Bacon's view of scientific methods and René Descartes' scientific method? And like I said before, they both articulated competing scientific methods. Bacon believed in empiricism, also known as inductive reasoning, and Descartes believed in deductive reasoning. But I think we can pretty much conclude that Sir Francis Bacon's methods won out. So going on to the Enlightenment, what's the difference between the divine right of kings and Thomas Hobbes' support of absolutism. Kings and many government officials, such as James I and Louis XIV, believed that the reason that they were in power, the reason they were on the throne, was because God put them there, and therefore they were really only answerable to God. And therefore no man, no group of men should have the authority to limit their power in any way. Hobbes also supported the idea that kings should have absolute power, but he was much more political and scientific about it. His arguments didn't have anything to do with God or divine rights. Instead, Hobbes argued that humans are by nature cruel and selfish, and that they needed a powerful ruler who could maintain order and protect the people from their own worst inclinations. And he described the social contract as an agreement between a ruler and his people. And that social contract spelled out what rights the people gave up and what the ruler provided to them in return in terms of order and security. There's always a social contract between a ruler and his or her subjects, even if it's not spelled out on paper. So describing Montesquieu's philosophy, Montesquieu applied scientific principles to the study of government. Now let's make a connection here between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution had discovered laws that govern the universe, natural laws. Our Enlightenment people looked at that and they said, what if we took these same principles of study and inquiry, these same methods, and we applied them to human institutions like, for example, government, economics, the justice system, education, child rearing, etc. Might we discover laws that govern those things? And if we could identify those laws and harness those laws, how might we improve society? And so Montesquieu applied scientific principles to government, and he researched the inner workings of the British government. And he described such things as separation of power, different branches of government, executive, legislative, judiciary. And he described the system of checks and balances that kept each branch from dominating the others. And he put all of this in a book called The Spirit of Laws. Voltaire described Voltaire's philosophy. Voltaire was the feistiest of the Enlightenment philosophers. He was the most clever of them all. He was a proponent of deism. One time he said something that I thought was really clever, just to kind of sideline here. He once said, I know God is real because if he wasn't, man would have to invent him. And so, as a deist, he taught that the creator of the universe set the universe up to run basically by itself according to natural laws that the creator had set up. So therefore, God's workmanship is revealed in nature, not in Scripture. Deism rejects Scripture. It rejects things like original sin. The idea that God is your Lord or your helper or your protector or your redeemer is rejected by deism. Deism doesn't believe any of that. Voltaire was a big fan of religious tolerance. If you were a Protestant in France who was being persecuted by the French government, Voltaire would advocate for you passionately and publicly. But if you were Jewish, all bets were off. He felt that Jews could never be loyal Frenchmen. At the same time, he also wrote extensively about natural rights. Go figure. Describe Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the anti-Enlightenment philosopher. He felt that the Enlightenment was too rationalistic and too based on reason, and that it underemphasized the importance of feelings and emotion and intuition and spirituality. And he wrote a book called The Social Contract. But in Rousseau's description, the social contract was not between a ruler and his subjects, but among the citizens of a society. He believed that a society should be governed by something that he called the general will, the will of a body of people expressed through good laws. That general will, however, only worked, only emerged properly if the citizens were truly moral and virtuous. And how do you get a society to arrive at a sufficient level of morality and virtue? Through education. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the French Revolution. Describe Denis Diderot's philosophy. Diderot's major accomplishment was his 20-year-long encyclopedia project. And it had over 100 contributors. It had 72,000 articles, of which he himself contributed 6,000. Diderot's main belief, he had two, was that knowledge was for everyone, even secret knowledge. It was for everyone to share and everyone to benefit from. But he didn't just want the encyclopedia to give knowledge. That was only half of his objective. He also had the goal of changing the way that people thought, teaching people to think critically and objectively through this encyclopedia. Sometimes to that end, his encyclopedia was very funny. For example, if you looked up the word Eucharist in the encyclopedia, it simply said, "See cannibalism." And then we have Immanuel Kant. His philosophy was summed up in 3 words: dare to know. Think for yourself. Free yourself from the self-imposed tutelage under which you are encouraged to live by the self-appointed guardians of this world. Immanuel Kant lived in Prussia. He lived under the rule of the Hohenzollern dynasty, the Fredericks and the Frederick Williams. And he lived in one of the most militaristic and authoritarian states in Europe. And I think he resented the level of control that his government had over people. And he was also a prominent racist. He wrote a full-blown theory on race, which rationalized and justified slavery. So the Republic of Letters, what was it? It was a society of Enlightenment intellectuals from all over who wrote. That's why they're the Republic of Letters. They wrote everything. They wrote books and pamphlets and articles and plays, etc. One of the things they accomplished was, of course, the encyclopedia that was put together by Diderot and his partner in this project, D'Alembert, with its 72,000 articles. So, how did women contribute to the dissemination of Enlightenment thought? And the big word you want to know there is salons. Salons were not where you get your hair and nails done. Instead, salons were these exclusive dinner parties that wealthy, important women would host, where everyone would have a meal and then get together and have a chance to actually meet and talk to one of or more of these real live philosophers and ask them questions and discuss the latest Enlightenment ideas. And an invitation to one of these salons was highly coveted. And so women did have a role to play in the dissemination of Enlightenment ideas, even though they were largely excluded from the Enlightenment. And it can be argued that even though women knew they were excluded, they could see the long-term implications of the Enlightenment. And they could see that eventually Enlightenment thought would include them and give them access to all of these wonderful things like education and individual rights and access to politics and government, etc. So, what were some failures of the Enlightenment? Maybe you've already noticed some. The philosophers were complex people, and they were rife with contradictions and hypocrisies. they naturally struggled to maintain reason and rationality and objectivity in light of their own prejudices and biases. And this was even after they expressed value for other cultures and criticized outdated beliefs and outdated institutions. And this was especially true of gender and race. In fact, profits from slavery actually supported many of the philosophers and their work financially. So describe the enlightened absolutists. These words don't seem like they should go together. Absolutists who are fans of the Enlightenment. But these were absolute monarchs who attempted to implement certain Enlightenment ideas in order to improve and strengthen their own states. They often formed close friendships with Enlightenment thinkers. And that was just fine with these Enlightenment philosophers because actually, frankly, they viewed their mission to improve society as a top-down mission, not a bottom-up mission. If you want to start with society and improving it, you begin with the absolute monarch and his counselors and his advisors and his government, the elite. And so there was very much an elitist aspect to the Enlightenment. Elitism was very strong in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment did not see itself as some kind of a grassroots movement. So what are some aesthetic and philosophical differences between Rococo and Neoclassicism, the two artistic movements that are most closely associated with the Enlightenment? Rococo is overly ornate and idealized and even fairy tale-like. It has lots of pink and pastel in it. And it's not serious in terms of its tone. Pink is just not a serious color. And it tends to depict aristocratic people doing non-serious things like relaxing and enjoying life. Isn't it great? Not to be the riffraff of this world. Doesn't everybody wish they could be us? That's Rococo. Neoclassicism, on the other hand, is darker, starker, and definitely not pink. Backgrounds tend to be austere and have lots of straight, simple lines. But more importantly, neoclassicism is about virtue. Virtuous people, men, by the way, doing virtuous, serious, important things. Virtues like courage and determination and resolution and honor. Things like taking oaths and signing important documents and fighting for freedom. They felt that this was the kind of art that was needed to inspire people in this new age of ideas and values and progress. And so, describe the partition of Poland. What countries took part in the partition of Poland? And of course, you have Austria, Russia, and Prussia. Three powerful absolute monarchies, and they carved up Poland into oblivion amongst themselves over a period of about 23 years in three distinct phases. So why did these countries do it? What were they trying to accomplish? And perhaps more importantly, what were they trying to avoid? They did it mainly because they could. Poland was weak and they were powerful, and might makes right. Poland was also more liberal in its politics. Poland tried to establish only the second formal constitution in the world and the very first one in Europe. And that was something that absolute monarchs, no doubt, found threatening right on their front door. And finally, when you win a war, you need to show that you got something for winning it. Otherwise, you didn't really win. Russia had beaten the Ottoman Empire in a war, but everybody agreed that trying to claim pieces of the Ottoman Empire and carve it up would result in even more war and disrupt the balance of power in Eastern Europe. So they all agreed to compensate themselves with Poland instead, which was much less powerful than the Ottoman Empire. So, what did the rulers of all three of these countries have in common? Russia, Prussia, and Austria, of course, they were all absolute monarchs. So, what is the public sphere versus the private sphere? The public sphere is basically outside the home. It was the place where people went to interact with other people and discuss the latest social and political news. And it tended to be dominated by men. The private sphere was primarily inside the home, where the housework was done and where the children were raised and where all the tedium was, and women tended to be corralled into that space. So that leads us to chapter 18. There's not as much in chapter 18 to worry about as there is in chapter 16. But we do have some important questions. What were some social changes of the 18th century? As the agricultural revolution and its companion movement, the enclosure movement, proceeded, as early pre-industrial manufacturing began to develop, life began to be more urban and less rural. As colonial trade and the institution of slavery ramped up in the 18th century, there began a consumer revolution in which people's tastes and values experienced a dramatic shift. So what was economic life like for women? Women were very constricted in terms of what they could do to provide for themselves economically. They had very little access to education. They had no access to outside financing. They often worked as domestic servants or wage laborers, making the bare minimum. Their best shot at rising above all that was to find a husband and raise a family and be stuck essentially in the private sphere. So what was the effect of so much of this rapid urbanization? And keep in mind, historians point to about the year 1750 as a major turning point. The second half of the 18th century was much different from the first half of the 18th century. These two halves are quite distinct from each other socially. So this urbanization had great social implications. Traditional rural values and controls on behavior weakened, obviously. Prostitution increased. Illegitimate births greatly increased. Poverty in these cities increased. Alcoholism increased. And health declined. And feelings of anonymity and isolation increased. And this kind of brings us to a big topic for us in chapter 18, the idea of the consumer revolution, consumerism. This was a phenomenon in Europe in which the amount and variety of consumer goods and luxury goods exploded, and so did the demand. Commodities such as tea and coffee and rum and sugar and cotton and tobacco exploded. Luxury items like fashions and apparel and textiles and accessories and porcelain and lots of books on all kinds of subjects exploded. Houses had more specialized rooms and partitions to provide more privacy. And all of these fashionable things, these commodities, these luxury goods, these clothes, they all serve to blur the lines between the middle class and the aristocracy, who were used to having exclusive access to these things. But now that these things were becoming more available and more affordable, the middle class was able to experience these things also and kind of feel like they were sharing in what the aristocracy gets to do. People began also to identify themselves by the things that they consumed, in addition to such things as their occupation or their religious affiliations. What kind of rum do you drink? What kind of fashions do you wear? What kind of snuff do you use? All of that was something that people began to identify themselves with. What was its subgenre? The reading revolution. Reading was a big part of the consumer revolution. Before people read mostly sacred books like the Bible, but now people had access to books about an endless number of topics. And thanks to the way that rooms in houses were being repurposed and specialized for privacy, there was now a place for people to be alone and enjoy more leisure time. There was no recorded music, there was no Netflix, there was no Hulu, there was no surfing the web. So the primary thing to do with one's leisure time was to read. And reading alone, reading silently for one's own personal, private enjoyment became a big thing. So, what institution powered much of the Enlightenment and the consumer revolution? Perhaps most importantly, these people were largely willfully ignorant of the fact that this lifestyle was made possible in large part by slavery. Slaves in the colonies were growing and harvesting all of the raw materials that went into these luxury products, and their lives were, of course, brutal. And this would change in the 19th century when stories coming out of the colonies about the cruelty of slavery started gaining traction with the public. So who were the Jansenists? Jansenism was the Catholic form of the more general movement known as Pietism. And it was largely a reaction to the efforts by state governments to exert more control of their subjects through their manipulation of the church. Whom did some of their beliefs and practices resemble? Some of the practices of in Jansenism resembled Calvinism. For example, they believed in predestination, and they also called for more austerity in the church, like Calvinism did. And that's why Catholic authorities hated Jansenism and often called it the Calvinist heresy. So, what did they stand for? Well, Jansenism was a back to the basics movement. Let's make the religious experience a more emotional and spiritual one. Let's close that gap between the clergy and lay people, and let's live out our religious values 7 days a week instead of just on Sunday. So what were they against? They were very much against state control of the church. Basically, Pietists in Protestant countries and Jansenists in Catholic countries were telling the secular authorities, the more you attempt to control our lives through the church, the less dependent upon the church we will become. So that is it. That is the review for our Unit 4 test. Go through this, and I'm sure you will do great on it.